Hello, I'm Mary Icho, and I am a broadcast journalist based in Toronto, formerly with CBC Radio. I am very pleased and honored to be a part of this forum. We have been hearing and will continue to hear important stories about anti Asian racism and its presence in Canadian universities. And by listening and learning from the experiences of others, this forum hopes to drive meaningful action and change. One of the questions that I've wondered about is how does the lived experience of anti Asian racism turn into leadership? Pam Sugiman is the Dean of the Faculty of Arts at Ryerson University. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Toronto, and she is a Sansei, third generation Japanese Canadian who has devoted much of her academic career to explorations of racism in Canada. Hi, Pam. Thanks for joining this conversation.
Hi, Mary.
I wonder if we can go back and talk about your family's experiences during World War II and internment and the impact that it had on them.
Well, the Second World War internment had an impact on all of my family, and most directly on my ancestors, my grandparents, both sets of grandparents, my parents, and aunts, uncles, all my relatives. It affected men and women differently. And so my mother and her family had lived in a small town, which was then called Haney, BC. So their farm was taken away from them. All of this newly plowed land, they plowed it themselves, all the children. It was a large family and a berry farm. And so they had to leave the farm and lost the farm and was only given a very small amount of money in return from the Canadian government. And they were put in a remote site of internment in Rosebery, British Columbia. My father was a young man at the time of the war, and he, growing up in Vancouver, decided that there was no reason for him to leave his hometown. And so he resisted the RCMP's orders and was put in a prisoner of war camp in Petawawa, Ontario, Northern Ontario, and then was put in labor camps and road camps in Ontario. And so the impact was very violent initially, and it lasted. It lasted over the years, and I could see it in their reticence to talk about certain things, in their attempts to be as invisible as possible, in the kinds of work that they ended up in, very much shaped by the government, as part of this repatriation decision made by the government, either take up the work in Ontario and move to Ontario, work that they had suggested, or go back to Japan, being certainly inaccurate because they had never lived in Japan. And that impacted on me as well, though I certainly didn't live through the Second World War. I indirectly experienced it and have indirect memories of the internment. It taught me a lot about racism and the pain that my ancestors endured and the injustices they endured during the Second World War.
hmm you talk about their reticence, and that was a common experience among Japanese Canadians at that time. And you've written about it as well, about this silence of your family and also the shared silences within the community. Where do you think this silence came from?
I think the silence came from fear, for one, and it came from a lack of interest on the other hand. Fear on the part of my parents and all most Japanese Canadians of their generation, fear that if they spoke about it, that their own children and ultimately their grandchildren would have to relive it and could be traumatized by it. Fear that if they spoke too much about it, there would be a backlash against them, that they would have to endure some of the same kinds of treatment that they endured during the Second World War, and silence as well, because no one was asking them questions about what they went through. It almost seemed as though it didn't even happen. And so I didn't ask them questions until I was, in my 30s. I didn't ask them any questions, or maybe more than a couple of superficial questions about what happened at that point in time. So we didn't talk about it, and that kind of
Yeah, but
talk
that's
wasn't
interesting.
encouraged.
Let me ask you though, the why you didn't ask them questions, why did you not ask questions? What was behind that?
I think it's really complex. I think that I didn't want to. I hear the answers. I didn't want to myself identify as a Japanese Canadian. I grew up in a very homogeneous neighborhood, largely Eastern European, Anglo Saxon, and I did not identify as a Japanese Canadian. And I wanted to be white. Many of us wanted to be white. And so I was denying my own racial identity. And so to ask them about how they were treated on the basis of their race would force me to grapple with it. And I wasn't prepared to do that at the time. And
Hmm.
so I should have, in retrospect, I should have asked them.
But do you also think, though, there was a form of protection in that as well? That even though your parents didn't speak about it, you could sense it. And from the little that they did say, you knew that they were deeply wounded from that experience and you wanted to protect them.
For sure. I mean, I protected them as a child, as a young child, even in so many ways. I thought that if they were asked too many questions, then they would be re-traumatized. That would be asking them to relive that horrible experience in their lives. I knew they were still dealing with it years and years, decades after. But I didn't want to be responsible for bringing that back into their lives in a more overt way. And I never talked to them about the racism that I was experiencing as a child, as a teenager at school. And I experienced lots of racism. But I wanted to protect them just as they wanted to
Mhm.
protect me from racism.
That's kind of an interesting thing too in and of itself, because I know you're interested in the whole witness and bystander experience, and that there should be more documented on that. When a community is silent about the wrongs that have been done to them, both individually and also collectively, is that a different kind of bystander effect that's going on? I mean, what's happens there, because there's silence all around, and then nothing comes out, and we never know the true story or stories.
Yeah. There were, and it's important to keep in mind that there were lots of people, non-Japanese Canadians, who did experience the internment as well in a different way as bystanders and as witnesses. There were school teachers who had Japanese Canadian students in their classes. One day they were there, the next day they were just gone. Did they explain the absence of Fumiko or Yumi to the rest of the class? No. From all accounts that I've heard and read, no. There were people who purchased the land at a very good price that had been taken from Japanese Canadians. There were neighbors, there were the RCMP officers, there were missionaries, there were friends as well, neighbors and friends. Some of them felt horrible about what had been happening to Japanese Canadians. Others may not have felt that way. Others didn't feel that way. Others took advantage of the injustices and looted their homes, moved into their homes, their vacated homes,
Mhm.
and ransacked property as well.
And then what about when it came to your own experiences? Because you said that you also experienced racism growing up. What happened to you?
Oh, as a young child, I experienced a lot of direct racism, what we'd call prejudice, name calling, awful, vicious name calling. Sometimes the name calling combined with different other kinds of assault, like throwing snowballs at me, and calling me racist names, asking me, to go back to where I, or telling me to go back to where I came from. There were many incidents, very uncomfortable memories in school. And all of this did take place within school. Um, I remember one girl, we were working on a group project, and she kept on staring at my face. And then eventually she asked me about my eyes. And she said, isn't that weird that you don't have a double eyelid? Like you don't have the eyelid. And then she said, "Do you have trouble seeing?" And she was not joking. She was serious in asking this question. I was so stunned and offended and embarrassed. And what made it worse is that my friends were part of that group, and no one said anything in my defense. And those
Mm.
people who through the years have said something, have stood up for me, stood by me. I remember all of those incidents. There weren't that many, but I remember them very vividly.
Yeah. And did the racism change as you grew older? What were your experiences then when you became an academic?
Well, the races changed in part because I changed, but also because society was changing and continues to change, as we know. So it became less acceptable to call me names, to shout out at me in the street. Um, still happens. It still happens today, and more so to other groups than to Japanese Canadians. But it changed in that it became more nuanced, especially within the educational sector, within the university. And so in course evaluations, I would get comments that were informed by people's perceptions of me as a racialized person, but also as a woman. And, we never walk into a room as a Japanese Canadian only or Japanese Canadian woman. You're a Japanese Canadian woman, in my case, from the working class. And so, I would be known as that Chinese lady. So a comment both on my race and my gender, and not on the basis of the kind of knowledge that I could impart in the classroom. And so the discrimination I faced was much more nuanced. It also is more systemic. It's built into the institution. So less direct interpersonal discrimination, but you know, we talk about microaggressions a lot. I remember one time I was at another university where I was teaching. I was standing and waiting for an elevator, and there were a bunch of students. I taught large classes, so I didn't. They didn't. I didn't know all of them by name, but I could tell that they were in my class because of the things they were saying. And I noticed that they were referring to another professor, a white man, as Doctor So and So. And then when they talked about me, they called me Pam, and that's fine. But when they're referring to someone else, one of my colleagues, with the title and me as Pam, that told me something about how they were distinguishing me
Hmm.
from the colleague.
Yeah. So, how do you think then all these experiences of racism, both personal and also through the many, many stories you've heard from other people, how did those motivate you and shape you as a leader?
Well, everything I do as a leader is through the lens of race. It's through an understanding, and I would think a deep understanding of racism, the ways in which it operates within an institution, and its impact on people. Um, you know, that has to inform. every decision made, from the recruitment of new faculty. And we've done a lot of this over the last several years at Ryerson, and the importance of prioritizing certain types of hires. We've hired a lot of Indigenous faculty members. We're in the process of hiring more Black faculty members who are just, both groups are severely underrepresented within the faculty. And decisions about tenure and promotion. When an Indigenous faculty member comes up for tenure, how are we evaluating the research that they've done? Much of it is community-based. Do we value that? We should be valuing it. Much of it STEM is motivated by personal histories, personal experiences, and there's accountability. The researcher is accountable to the community. They build relationships. All of that takes more time. There are lots of decisions that are made. Who should sit on a committee? Who shouldn't be always asked to sit on a committee and do certain kinds of service for the university? We have to have an understanding of racial and gender politics and other forms of marginalization, the ways in which the institution is colonial, and ways in which we can decolonize the institution, change curriculum. All of that is I take into account, or at least I try to.
And what do you hope comes out of this conference?
I hope many things come out of the conference. For one, I would be very happy if all of the Asian Canadians who are participating, whether they be staff or students or faculty members or observers, have a greater sense of themselves as Asian Canadians, a positive sense of themselves. And that's what I really gleaned from the inaugural UBC, National Forum on Anti-Asian Racism. I thought, oh, these are some extremely talented students in particular. And I felt very proud of who I am and who they are. I would also like us to have a better understanding, a deeper understanding of the ways in which systemic discrimination is very much a part of our university community, university communities throughout the country. And I want to inspire through this national forum hope, informed hope, a realistic vision of how to move forward and to truly effect transformative change.
Thank you very much, Pam, for this conversation. I certainly learned a lot about what motivates you as a leader and continued success with your work.
Oh, thank you, Marion. Thanks for your interest in the forum and for your participation.
Thank you. That's Pam Sugiman. She is the Dean of the Faculty of Arts at Ryerson University in Toronto.